So welcome to Intent, to this FBN session. We're very happy to be here in partnership with Intent. It's day 2 at Davos. For those of you who decided to do a dry Davos, I'm sure you're all set and fine. You had your yoga session at 6, and then your, workshop at 7, and then your tea at 8. For those of you who spent the evening at Intent last night, it was definitely not a dry night, but we enjoyed. So, my name is Alexis. I'm the CEO of the Family Business Network. We're hosting this session this morning in partnership with Intent. For those of you who don't know FBN, we are a global network, a foundation, a not-for-profit foundation based in Switzerland. We've been operating for 40 years, and we gather 5,000 families around the world in 60 countries. And talking about dry Davos, I always use an explanation to say what we do, which is a bit weird, but you'll understand. We're like the Alcoholic Anonymous of family business. Okay, so we bring families in a safe space where they can come and learn from each other on how to reconcile the family, which is about emotions, conflicts, hopefully love, with the business, which is about entrepreneurship, power, investment. And when you bring the two together, you create wonderful things, or you destroy lives. Now, people would say, what does it matter to destroy family business owner lives? Well, family business is 70% of the economy worldwide. And a lot of people think we are 70% of the problem. But at FBN, we've now embarked over the past 15 years on a journey to say we actually want to be 70% of the solution. And why? Because as you learned from the 3 panelists today, business owning families think in generations, not in quarters. And I think in today's world, which is very short term, I think it's a fundamental element to drive system change, is to be able to take the long-term view and continue to do the right thing. And we're not afraid to say the right thing, even as the world changes and as the headlines keep on bringing bad news. We want to continue to bring that long-term view and leverage, and we'll talk about that, what we call the polycapitals of business-owning families. Families have obviously access to their enterprises, but they have also access to investments, they have access to philanthropic capital, and they also have access to their voice, their advocacy. I mean, we are hosted by a family and a family leader that has a strong voice and that is not afraid, as those of you who were at the New York Times session yesterday, is not afraid to use his voice to bring system change. So, without further ado, let me introduce you 3 panelists, and I'm going to invite you to come on stage. Marianne Tsao from the Tsao family, Singapore-based family, originally in shipping. Marianne is one of the... Yes, please come. Welcome. And all 3 are FBN members. Marianne is... pick your chair. You're the first one. Marianne is the chairwoman of the Tsao Family Philanthropy Foundation, and she also runs the family office, or one of the family offices in the family. Originally a medical doctor, lived in New York for decades, and moved back to Singapore to be involved with the family about 10, 15 years ago now. 30 years ago already. Our second panelist is Charles-Antoine Janssen from Belgium, coming from a long legacy of multiple business-owning families. Welcome, Charles-Antoine. And Charles-Antoine created about 20+ years ago Cois Impact, which is now a well-known impact investment fund, active in Europe and India. And he will tell us a little bit about his story, about how he started his own journey, and then how he could leverage his own journey, then back into the family business. And then we have a next gen, Isabel Hoffman, please, in the middle. All right, that's going to be fine. Isabel has just started her own journey in different nature organization. Up to a few days ago, she was working for Climeworks. She's been even involved in Replanet. Some of you who are regular attendees here have heard about Replanet, as well as a Capitals Coalition, I suppose. And she'll tell us about how challenging it can be as an ex-gen with a big legacy, and then how you sort of start to find your own way. You focus on your first name more than on your last name. So are we ready? So it's a 2-hour session. The first part is going to be the panel, who hopefully is going to inspire you. And then the second part is going to be a workshop led by Falko Paetzold from CSP. Where's Falko? In the back with the red tie. Hi, Falko. You know about CSP. And he's going to help us go one step further about thinking how can we leverage those polycapitals. I mean, I know not all of you are family business owners, but many of you know investors and you're in touch with them. And how can we sort of be more coherent into tapping on those different polycapitals, bring them together, then bring investors together, and then really work on system change. So get ready for a great workshop afterwards, and hopefully you'll be inspired by the stories here. 3 parts for the panel. The first part is really, we learn from them on this legacy. Is it a burden, or when there's a trigger point happening, you know, what happens, and how do you sort of cope with that legacy? Then secondly, they'll tell us a little bit about their own journey, and when they start intervening, when they start acting, you know, what are some of the challenges, what are the opportunities, and suddenly you discover you have access to different forms of capitals, and then you can start to work with them. And then in the end, we know it's hard and challenging when you start to involve more family members, more families, more investors, and you start to work on system change. Then what happens? And then how do you sort of go beyond those hurdles, and what are the tensions, and how do you learn to live with those tensions, because they're part of our lives. Okay, are we fine with that? Marianne, maybe let's start with you, because you have, you said about 30 years of history. When did you discover that legacy? I think you moved back because your dad called you and said, you know, I need you at home. And you know, what was the sort of trigger point for you?
Yeah, I always say that about 25 years ago, when my father was getting a little older, and at one point we thought, well, you know, father's getting older, we need to think about it. And at that time, the 4 in my generation all do different things. So Fred, who some of you may know because he runs TPC House, he was sort of the family business scion. He's actually 3rd in the family. My older brother's an architect, and I was actually, in my family those days, girls are not that involved. They're not really offered opportunities, so I was doing my own thing, running a foundation or whatever. So I think at that time, the 4 of us thought, you know what, as a family, we need to think about what's going to happen. Good thing, because my father passed away maybe 7 years after that, but at that time, he was still quite well, and it allowed us time to think about how we could organize amongst ourselves, and consulted him how we could organize. So I think that was important to start think early. I think we thought about it when he's really frail, it might be a little late, because we won't be able to engage him in that conversation. And it was an interesting conversation. The second point I want to make was it didn't start with him. He had no idea how to deal with the 4 of us. He said, all 4 of us will never agree, you know. You can never divide assets. He didn't even know how to write a will, because he couldn't figure out what to do. So 4 of us got together and said, well, you know, we're not going to divide anything. As a family, we want to collectively manage our assets, and as a family, help us stay together. And so that really helped him a lot, because, you know, great. We basically wrote the will for him, more or less, because basically it referred to what the 4 of us did. And the 4 of us went on a journey for several years, because in the beginning, as much as we loved each other, we couldn't really communicate each other very well. We used to argue about everything and can't get everywhere. So we have to build our own relationships and know the 4 of us had a common goal, common values, and learn how to communicate. Took a few years, and then we're able to then work through how we want to organize, you know, the family assets we want to do with it, which ultimately we basically want to commit all to impact, because we all were okay. We can have enough to take care of our children or whatever.
So there was a fundamental alignment in the siblings,
right,
to start the conversation together.
Right. It was work. It took work.
It took work.
The decision was to do something about it, but it took some work before we can actually communicate well and find a common ground to decide what we want to collectively.
Thank you. Charles-Antoine, your dad, at one point of time, ran the 2 family business at the same time together. He was CEO on both sides. So,
no, he was CEO and deputy CEO.
And deputy CEO, okay. Still, when you know, when you have that legacy, and you're in your 20s, how, you know, what happens? What's, you know, how do you look at that? How do you absorb that? And then how did you decide to create your own path?
I'd say it's probably rather heavy. So I had tensions between my philosophical quest. That was really when I was 16 to 22. I would see humans, they all seemed to be similar, even if they came as big CEOs at home or ministers, and then anyone else. And me, I couldn't see a very big difference, but still there were clear expectations. So philosophy was a bit of an anchor, but at the same time, I couldn't put the pieces together, and I was a very low average student. But so then I saw that my ancestors had really managed to have a balance between serving themselves, serving the family, and serving society. And that really had been a red line from the Blicquy, the side, and Bracht, the side of my mother's family, going up to 10 generations ago. Then on the side of my father, there was Ernest Solvay, who had established Social Security 6 generations ago, before it was legal. And my father, who was a founding member of the Club of Rome, while at the same time the CEO of a chemical company, one of our family business companies, Solvay, in the 70s. So there was really some sort of overarching values that I could connect to, the quest for truth across generations, the quest for freedom, inner freedom and outer freedom. And on the inner freedom side, I was particularly blessed to have a mother who practices meditation. So without meditation, I think I would be dead 4 times and crazy in an asylum today. And so she brought that notion of inner freedom in our lives. And but our family had always been liberals, so we were always fighting for freedom of speech, freedom of ideas, freedom of academic institutions, freedom between legislative, executive, judiciary, and business. And then that notion of service, as I said, which is really hard, and still today I struggle. Sometimes I'm really pushy and I just want it, be it in our impact investing business, and I'm like, whoa, why do you want that? Do you want it for yourself? Do you want it for the money? Do you want it for the recognition? Do you want it for society? Do you truly want it for patients, all patients? Do you truly want it for the earth and all living creatures? So that service is not easy. And then there's, when getting involved in the family business, what's the line between serving the family, serving all shareholders, serving all stakeholders? When it's in a listed company, even more so. So there you really need to navigate that balance finely.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing so intimately. I think it's interesting to hear that the legacy, creates a big debate internally and conversation. And we learn about how you went through that journey and then found your own path. Now, Isabelle, you're the only next gen on the panel, and so you have full freedom, as I told you, to talk only about yourself. And as we say at FBN, the difference between what we call the next gens and the now gen is, the now gen, you start to have responsibilities, towards the family, towards the stakeholders, and failure is no longer an option. Well, for a next gen, failure is good. Fail fast, obviously, and learn from it. But, you can still fail and learn from it. And I'm not going to ask you about your failures, but I'm going to ask you about, when we were preparing the session, you said there's that moment when you think about legacy and, you're told it's important to preserve it. And then you realize at one point of time you can maybe start to do something else with it, deploy it. Can you tell us a bit where you are with that and what sort of were the first trigger points?
Yeah, sure. And thank you to my co-panelists for being so candid in your introductions. It makes me feel like I can share a bit more openly already. So I suppose it's slightly different than what you've shared in that I have first come to my purpose and what I find interesting and I'm passionate about and what I wanted to do, which is the combination of nature and business and how we can use private capital to restore and conserve nature. And that was really what was driving me in my teens and in my 20s, what I studied, where I worked. And I think it was probably only when I was like 28 that I realized that I had a kind of a legacy or an ecosystem around me that would allow me and enable me to achieve those goals and those objectives at a different level to what I was doing in my career at that moment. And that has a lot of great things about it and a lot of very stressful things about it as well. So, you know, I studied ecology. I wanted to be a marine biologist. I think probably every girl in this room wanted to be a marine biologist when they were a teenager. And while I was studying and writing my dissertation, I discovered something called the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And my mind was blown because it was finally this combination of ecology and biology and systems and also business. And so I could be this like businesswoman, but also do nature. And so, you know, retroactively, I look back on it and I think, you know, maybe the path was laid for me without me really realizing. I have a legacy in business with my family's business. I have a legacy in conservation and nature with the founding of WWF and my family foundation around nature. But it didn't look like that. It's joining the dots, looking back on it, as opposed to having planned the route to where I am today. And what I do today for work is I'm an entrepreneur in the space of nature-positive businesses. So I try and help businesses grow where they have a very strong link to how we can conserve and restore nature.
Thank you, Isabel. I mean, I like what you say about nature. Legacy is like nature. You know, it's not static. It's an evolving system. And then every generation takes it over and start to sort of shape it, reshape it, transform it. And you have different entry points. In your case, it was moving back home, working with your siblings. In your case, it was really an inner journey of wondering, you know, what does this mean? In your case, it was like that trigger point when you were studying and you realized that there was a big ecosystem. So it really, you see that generational mindset that arrives and that allows the legacy to be a living thing and not just such a burden that you pass on from one generation to the other. Now, from legacy to intervention, let's switch gear a little bit. And I mean, lots of good intentions, I'm sure, in all your families. What's happening when you want to start to act, to invest, to change, and you realize that some of the existing structures, frameworks, organizations, vehicles are not really apt anymore and working anymore for what you want to try to do? Marion, can you, as you start talking to your siblings, what's happening there?
So my father had a family office, which is a traditional family office. We closed it. We started a new team. And it took us like 3 rounds to eventually find out with a team that more or less aligned with what we wanted to do. We're quite lucky because the 4 of us are of like mind. I think if some of us didn't agree with it and wanted to a share of the wealth, I think personally that would not have worked very well. So I'm quite grateful the 4 of us are like mind. In some ways, sometimes quite remarkable because there's quite a lot there, right? I mean, any piece would be quite nice, but we didn't really feel like we needed it, and that was really important. And then the next generation, the 5th generation is coming up, and they have the same mindset, which I'm not sure how it happened, but I'm grateful it did. You know, that we feel that the assets, you don't really need to spend so much on yourself. We have more than enough, and then the rest of it should just all go toward something useful. And I think the issue of service is maybe it came a long time. I mean, you know, people asked me a long time ago what was my goal in life, and I said to be of service. I'm thinking, where did that come from, you know? And I think that notion also came maybe from my mother, who always had that notion of service in different ways. So all of us have some sense that we should be of service. But then being organized is different. We all do our own things, one thing, but being organized and collectively use or deploy our assets in a strategic way is quite new for us. So once we decide what we want to do, it's actually quite easy. to come up with a strategy to see how we want to deploy our resources, how do we want to impact, and how impact investment we should be related to how do we philanthropy. Really, ultimately, it's about change. Like what kind of change you want to see, and therefore what you do deploy, what vehicle, whether it's business, philanthropy or investment, to make it work better.
It was a pretty radical change because you were historically in shipping, mining, plantations, and then suddenly now you're talking about the well-being economy, aging, health. Can you illustrate a little bit about what was the trigger and how you were able to move that ship?
Yeah, I think it's sensible, right? Okay, shipping is still tough. We're still in shipping. I mean, that is our family legacy. At one point, just say, should we just ditch shipping and do something else? Frankly, the easier way to make money than shipping, frankly. But however, shipping is necessary. You do need to move goods from one point to another point. It is our family legacy for many generations. So we decided we can't ditch shipping, but we're trying to make it as the least disruptive of environment as possible. So we do invest a lot in ocean-related kind of issues, and then try to mitigate whatever negative impact shipping has on the environment. But the rest of it, we don't need to do our mining, ditch that. We don't need to do it. We just sold them all because we just don't believe in it, so sell it. So we went through all our portfolios, whether it's the stuff to operational business we owned or our investment. We just cleaned it up as much as we can. Some of the stuff, okay, there's no timing. We sold them at maybe a little better time, but fundamentally, we just want to strip everything out. And both in the family office of Fred and I run like two different portfolios. So I run the family office. He has his own thing. So we basically have the same view. So some of you who, so it's for us to align our purpose, align how we do things wasn't that difficult.
But I like what you said about that sense of responsibility, and we're back to the thinking in generations, not in quarters. Even though it would have been easier to sell the ships and to sell the shipping, you decided to transform it from within, with that idea of, we own those legacy assets, maybe we'll sell them one day, and that's okay. But in the meantime, we're not just going to sell them, as dirty as they are, and let somebody else do the
I think fundamentally you
work.
still need to move products from one store to the other side. That is a service that's essential, right? You can't just say, get out of here and then whatever. So we feel that there's something we know something about. We've been shipping for generations. We're good at it. And we're able to still provide important service, but we can actually transform. So I know that I'm not so deep involved with shipping, but I know Fred has done a lot about redesigning the ships to making sure that the minimally disruptive, trying to be able to make it so that it's more efficient when you run them, all that sort of thing. In addition to what happens to the terminals, the ports, and all that kind of stuff, trying to making sure that all those are kind of lined up.
Thank you. Coming to you, Charles-Antoine, a very strong, deeply rooted industrial legacy, and then you say, I'm going to create an impact investment fund, and that's my calling. And what happens then? I mean, what are some of the opportunities that you see suddenly, but also some of the hindrances, some of the obstacles as you start that project?
So first, I started my career in London at Schroeder's, where I got an internship for 3 months, thanks to my father. Then they offered me to stay, although I had never studied finance. And I said, "Ooh, no, thanks. I got the internship thanks to my father." So I went to Merrill Lynch, who luckily hired me. And it was super exciting. Capital markets, money making. My father called me one day and said, "Have you become like Shylock?" And I hadn't realized really what he meant, but then I started thinking, he might be right. But then after a few years, I realized just making money for money, on top of it for shareholders I had no connection with and I had never seen. So I decided to fix myself an objective in salary and title, and then I left. And then I joined our family business. And there I was first in charge of M&A. It was extremely exciting, and it was very meaningful for the future of the company. And then I ran Austria, India, and emerging markets. And in Austria with Tatiana. And in emerging markets, I was really struck that everyone was focusing on the 30% richer patients of India and emerging markets, but the needs were actually the 70% poorer. And so I started talking about that to our top management more and more, and they were looking at me like, frugal innovation, what's that? Why would we be interested in that? So there I realized, okay, there's a fracture here, and it's not going to work. If I want to work on how do we serve the 50% poorer patients of the globe, which, you know, for me, I'm quite lucky, the apple didn't fall too far from the tree. It's healthcare at UCB, and my passion is serving low and middle income patients, the 4 billion poorer patients. I realized I need to leave. And so that's when using capital became clear. And but then what capital? So I was quite lucky, actually. I just realized now that our father had given my two brothers and I a certain amount of capital when we were 20 or so. We had called it B2B. And my passion today, I had forgotten about it, but my passion is beekeeping. And we lost most of that money, but it was luckily a very small amount, and we learned a lot in our 20s. And then came that notion of impact. So that seemed super exciting. Do we combine capital and optimize market solutions with capital that's scalable at market rates? Or do we use blended finance instruments with guarantees and outcome funding for cases in which we cannot guarantee a commercial return? And so that was the start of COIS, where we decided quickly to have those two arms, having seen that certain purely philanthropic initiatives will not scale through Toolbox with you. And so we realized that pure philanthropy is great in some cases. In other cases, you need to combine philanthropy, outcome funding, guarantees, blended finance to reach really some societal issues, be they social or environmental, that cannot, without that, start scaling at least, or maybe even continue funded that way. And then some is really exciting because you can use the power of capitalism and the power of business innovation, be it just business models or scientific innovations, to solve large-scale societal problems. But then you really have to make sure that those values remain rooted at the core of the business and that greed doesn't take over.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that very honestly. And I think it's interesting to see how there's still a very big entrepreneurial mindset in what you're sharing with us after 10 generations. It's not about, it should only be philanthropy. It should be venture philanthropy. It's a combination of solutions, innovative, a combination of a polycapital solution to tackle different issues. And then we'll conclude. We'll come back to your legacy business at the end, because you shared something with me recently that now that you're back home also in parallel as a governor of the family business, you're starting to see that some of the seeds you planted 10, 20 years ago in conversations with managers are starting to flourish. Isabel, so you get that wow moment. I'm part of a bigger ecosystem. Help or hindrance?
Both, I suppose. It's obviously a help in some situations, specifically in the social and symbolic capital from the framework. It obviously opens doors to have conversations with people that at 30 I wouldn't have access to normally. The reputation of my family name also helps me to get in the right rooms and so on. But it's most definitely not a free pass. I would say that my experience is that people end up expecting a lot more from you than they would if you were kind of an anonymous entrepreneur. So, you have to work doubly as hard, if I am allowed to say that, to gain the respect and credibility of people truly. So I've definitely, in the step that I've gone from being kind of an anonymous worker within a company to an independent person who's embracing my full legacy and everything that I can do, I've had to redefine my relationship with success. To me, success was something that wasn't for me. It was for other people who worked very hard and achieved success. But I'm sitting between two extremely successful people who also have a legacy, and I think that that's something really very inspiring, that it's okay to be a successful businesswoman even though I come from successful business people in the past. And true legacy, you know, preparing for this panel made me really think about what do I actually think it is. And to me it's you know, maintaining the success of your ancestors and of the past, but combining that with, you know, who I am as a person and fitting to what my purpose is now, and the times. What was successful in the past is not necessarily going to be successful in the future. And I think particularly when you bring ecology, environment, nature into the topic, we can't do what we were doing before. We have to do something slightly different. And something that's helped me to gain a lot of confidence in this space as well is reverse mentoring. You know, you may have heard of my father or picked up his book or, you know, heard him speak on a panel about natural, social, and human capital. I'm sure he won't mind me saying that he first learnt that term from me. I was an intern. Well, I can't take all the credit, of course, but a funny story, I was an intern during COVID for a wonderful organization called the Capitals Coalition, and I had to do my first presentation or webinar in those dark days of webinars. And I'd written out all my speaking notes, and I was very proud of my slides, and I got my parents to sit in the living room, and I said, now you're going to listen to me, I'm going to practice my talk. And I talked them through for half an hour about what the capitals were, why natural capital is important. And at the end, my dad looks at me and says, wow, that's so interesting. And yeah, so it goes both ways. I've gained a lot from the legacy, and I've also hoped to have contributed in that direction already.
Reverse mentoring, yeah, I think, and thank you for sharing that, and congratulations for continuing to do that, because each generation has to rethink its legacy. And with a big change in our times, it's probably for the first time in history, we have a new generation that knows much more about many things than the older generation. I mean, or the senior or the wise generation, whatever we call them. I mean, in the past, experience was basically it, and that was something that you could not purchase. You had to go through it, and it would take decades. Now we have a new generation who definitely knows more about nature, knows more about AI, knows more about technology. And I think, you know, if we can find the right spirit of dialogue, you know, we're at the WEF, we are hosted by the co-chair of the WEF, so the right spirit of dialogue across generation, and there's a lot of guilt, you know, between generations currently about, you know, what are you leaving us, you know, where are we, you know, can we still dream? But I think that reverse mentoring, I mean, keeps me optimistic about what comes next. Please.
Yeah. No, this is a very interesting phenomenon because my niece is here. Well, she's not in this room, but she came. And she has such wonderful ideas. So long when we're learning from other people saying, she started great ideas what to do. I felt like I'm working with a peer, not like aunt, niece, you know, kind of thing, because she has great ideas. So she think, well, my influence can get these people in a room and blah, blah, blah. But she has a whole plan, strategy worked out, how can mobilize younger generations in Asia to be more involved with climate, to be more interested in which is, you know, things like that. So I think that it's no longer like I'm just showing you what to do, but it's actually really like maybe it's reverse mentoring. We just feel like peers working together as a family to move something forward. It's not like in Asian families, you know, there's this thing, right? Generational things are a bit rigid. You know, I'm senior, you junior kind of thing. But the newer generation, I like to think we're part of that too. That the mind is much more open about how we work across generations. It doesn't say, well, I'm the older generation, so I call a shot. So that is a very nice change. I hope I see that across Asia a lot more.
It's a mindset.
Huh?
It's
mindset, absolutely.
We're going to wrap up, and because it's about accelerating change and system change. Now we get a sense of the individual stories and journeys, And then at one point of time, you're passionate about the bottom 70%, and you want to accelerate, you know. And yes, you deploy capital, you build a team, you start to have real impact. But system change is much wider than that. And so, Charles-Antoine, as we conclude, if you can give us a few hints and illustration about why we might have to be a bit patient, but as you plant those seeds along your journey, suddenly you have those wow moments, realizing, oh my God, what I said or did 20 years ago, 10 years ago, was not in vain. And maybe tell us, as now you're also, you know, you're still the co-founder and chair of a COIS, and that's probably most of your time today. You're also on the board of UCB, big pharma company in biotech, and you're pushing for that agenda of system change. Tell us a little bit about it, and what are some of the tips for the room about how, you know, we can be optimistic about continuing walking the talk.
Yeah, with pleasure. So, yeah, at UCB it's really nice because today, as vice chair of UCB, I work with a CEO who fully embodies. He's really a great human being dedicated to the greater health of all human beings. So that's a big privilege. And our chairman, with whom I obviously work very closely too, is also sensitive to all these issues. Now, there are nonetheless tensions, and I think the fact that when I was an employee, people knew, okay, this guy is a bit of a yoga and meditation freak. So it allowed a lot of people to feel free about establishing little mindfulness programs in the company and these kind of things, and not feeling that, you know, that was to be hidden and that it was a really lame kind of thing. And now with Jean-Christophe's human values, the quest for diversity, the quest for inner freedom, the quest for bringing generosity into the workplace and bringing one's whole self is really something that's quite openly done. Then the fact that they knew that I cared about the 50% lower income patients, and that the family cared about that generation after generation, we slowly started a program on healthcare access in epilepsy in India and in Africa, and it's been an interesting pilot. But today we still have nearly all our revenue that comes from the 30% richer patients, like most pharma companies around the world. So there's a big debate around those issues, and how determined should one be, and in which cases is it realistic for us, a biotech company that's designing fairly expensive to research, fairly expensive to develop, fairly expensive to manufacture drugs that would be accessible to all patients around the world. I mean, there's some cases where it's unrealistic. There's other cases where there's a lot that we can do. And I think that slowly but surely, in a company with a vice chair who is passionate about impact investing and might sometimes stubbornly say that the pharma industry is not totally patient-centric, but that today it's, in general, as an industry, slightly more rich, or significantly more rich patient-centric, but yet with shoots of innovation and dedication in India, in China, but also in some cases in the West. There is hope, and it's important to keep on, being on one hand tolerant, open, and listening, but also non-compromising when it comes to values that are about humanity. And that is difficult also because sometimes you think, ooh, I'm fully defending the human story here, but actually you realize, oh, but maybe I'm just defending my own little story. In that case, you better shut up.
Thank you, Charles-Antoine. Yeah, Isabelle, strong values, you discover your own potential, you see that it has an impact on your parents. Like Charles-Antoine and Marianne, you have siblings, and then you have stakeholders. How does that get along as you start to take your own position in the family, and what's your view on that? How's the dialogue, the spirit of dialogue going?
Yeah, actually what you say resonates a lot with me because we're all, in my family, we're the fifth generation, some cousins, some siblings, and we all have we're all different people. We've got strong purpose, strong visions, strong ideas. We all work on different topics. We've got our own careers. And we come together regularly and we create a space where we can talk about, exchange ideas about what we work on. But, we've got someone who's super into social impact, someone's, very into AI, I'm super into nature. You've got to somehow coalesce around certain topics and use those to exert your influence. And we're right at the beginning of our journey. We don't know exactly how or what or, what kind of influence we want to have as a group. But what we do have is a strength in unanimity. It's always how we've interacted as a family with the business, and it's how we intend to go forward as well. And I think what's super excited is this spirit of dialogue, here we are again, but even within our family, where we can bring to the table, and we've got opportunities to either coalesce around a topic that we find very important, or opportunities to work with each other outside of the family business system. So really using these different spheres of influence, we can collaborate on certain topics. And that's a very exciting thing. I really look forward to developing that within our family group as well.
Thank you, Isabelle. As we conclude, Marianne, capital is not enough. Business assets alone are not enough. Philanthropy is not enough. It's this intentional design. How do you create the space when you are with your siblings, with the next generation, to bring that intentional design that then, and hopefully Falko will help us to work on that intentional design of leveraging multi-capital and poly-capital?
So I guess we start to think of ourselves more like change makers. You have to evolve a different role as a family. What are we here to do other than we lead our life? And we just felt like, of course we have reasonable as if it's never enough, right? So I think that really notion is that we need to come together and figure out what kind of change is important. As it turns out, we spent a long time talking about it, and climate and health seems to be the thing, so we're not going for that. But I think the thing is actually just be more catalytic, like what Fred's trying to do at TPC House, is trying to say, can we come together? Can we collaborate? And just be more catalytic about it. Because in the end of the day, philanthropic dollars definitely not enough, because that's just dropping the business to what the business can do, right? So therefore, we really have to use philanthropy as a catalyst, and then we have to bring the businesses in. And I'm really proud of my brother, who is a really businessman. He thinks like that, but he wants business to be, as he likes to say, a force for good, right? I mean, the things are so that there's the outcome is not about money alone. It's really about also making sure that the business is doing something useful. It's not so straightforward, I would say. So on family office side, I don't run the business, I make impact investments. So it's investing in other businesses. But the real notion is that really as a family, we need to put all the energy to making the change we want to see. So once you sort of think about yourself differently, then it's a little easier to have this conversation, I think. I mean, not all four of us come to pick the picture with equal amount of zest, shall we say. But I think that we all bring something to the table. But the more important thing is that all four of us are aligned. The next generation coming up is also aligned. Now, we have the advantage that our family is small. So it's not like family with a gazillion people. It's pretty difficult, right? But we only have 4 in my generation and only 5 in the next generation. And so the older ones, only 2 who are older, and now they're actually coming to the fold. So I feel quite happy with this transition. But we're just lucky. Somewhere along the line, we're kind of values-wise kind of aligned. So, you know, yeah.
Thank you, Marianne. So creating that space for the spirit of dialogue, bringing intentional design, becoming more aware of the different sources of capital you have access to, and then creating that catalytic moment where you can act coherently and with intelligence, leveraging different forms of capitals at different time. And now we're going to conclude and move to the workshop with Falko, who's going to give you the tools, at least some of the tools to start that conversation and framework. And this is not the end. I mean, we want to move from learning to action. And at FBN, we're going to continue to bring families and many of you in our open spaces to catalyze capital. We call that open space. We had recently 2 families, the Tsao and Tharald, who came together, created its Ocean Fund. And we want to do that on different impact pillars and making sure that in Arles in May, in Doha with the UN in September, in Amsterdam with Catapult, and then in Cologne, our Global Summit, we continue to act. Because whatever the headlines is and will be during the next few days, let's continue to focus to act with intention. Thank you very much, all 3 of you. A big round of applause. And I also want to recognize in the room Andrew, my 2 colleagues, with our Chief Impact Officer, and Jenaan, Head of Impact at FBN. We're going to take this forward.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Charles-Antoine. Thank you, Isabel. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, and as Alexis said, we're going to move into workshop mode. But we also wanted to share a little bit of context, maybe a little bit more about FBN, the work we're doing, and put, I think, the workshop that Falko is going to do into a little bit of context. So if we could switch to the other presentation, please. Yep. Could we switch over to the present? Yep, there you go. Perfect. Great. So very quickly, so as Alexis mentioned, FBN is a global organization. We're actually a network of chapters. So we have 33 chapters around the world, representing about 5,000 business families, and we operate in 65 countries, and we have more than 25,000 individual members, which of those 8,000 are next gens. But really, it's about the 5 families that are at the center, 5,000 families that are at the center of the network. Next. Oh, go back one. Yep. So we'll talk just a little bit about the context. So FBN Impact is one of, there's 6 communities within FBN. And so there's the Next Gen community, the Now Gen, entrepreneurs, family office, large families, and impact. And really, the focus of what we're doing and a lot of the work we're focusing on going forward is this idea that we really believe strongly that family business is an essential link in the idea of systems change because of all of the different capitals that families bring to the table. And we've been on this journey, as Alexis mentioned, for about 12 years now. We started initially with a project called Polaris, where we really were focused on business transformation within the family. So how can the families transform their businesses? But over time, we've done about 50 cases, which are available on our website, which you're welcome to download and check out, and worked with a lot of families around what they were doing in sustainability, how to help accelerate their journey. But really where we also came to was an understanding that, as you heard on the stage today, not everyone in a family works in the family business. And so if you just have conversations about the family business, it's super important, and it's what anchors much of the legacy of the family, but it's also just one part of the story. And so where we really started to understand is that we needed to keep a real central focus on the business, but we also wanted to expand the conversation to talk about investment, philanthropy, and advocacy. And also a big evolution happened within the network as well, where as Alexis mentioned also, we're very focused on the safe space and this idea with families sharing with each other around the challenges that they're facing. But because of that, we also had a very strict non-solicitation policy. And it was really about families connecting and sharing with each other. But if we realized we really wanted to do more work in the impact space, we had to open up and allow people to have these deeper conversations around their work they were doing and share more information about the work they were doing. So really that's where we've evolved, and it's really about this idea of how can we help enable business families to create a positive impact in the world and build a lasting legacy across generation. And it comes back to creating pathways and thinking about how to allow families to connect and think about these things in different ways. And so how do we do that? A big part of it is just in the grounding piece around systems change and how can we help them learn about it. And we've collaborated with CSP and other great partners on that process. But it's also giving them space to have these conversations, and that's the open space piece that was just discussed. And we've identified so far 7 big themes where we see a lot of families actually already doing work, collaborating together, and moving the process forward. And so for us, it's really about, how can we get families to think a little bit more about how they can combine these different levers that they have, what we call the 4 drivers of change, to create a bigger impact. So how can they think about, working together, combining business, investing, philanthropy, and advocacy in different ways, rather than oftentimes in families, probably, and it's evolving a lot more these days, but previously, all of these things were siloed. And so how do we really start getting them to connect the dots and understanding, as some of the great examples you heard from the panelists, how they can combine these different drivers in different ways to actually create change and make change happen. So Jenaan is actually going to share an example from one of our members that's done a couple of our members that have done a lot of work in that space. And then we're going to hop into the workshop with Falko.
Hello. I'm going to talk about a place that's a little far from here and a little warmer than here. Does this photograph look familiar to anybody in the room? It was a photograph and similar photographs like this that were circulated quite widely a few years ago. This is when the lockdown in India was announced after the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. And what happened was India has millions of informal workers that are migrants from different states. And overnight, they lost their livelihood, they lost, their place where they were staying, they had absolutely nothing. And so thousands of informal workers ended up walking hundreds of miles back to their hometowns and lost their lives due to starvation, dehydration, suicide, accidents. And it was really an appalling scene. And so a few business families from my hometown, I'm proud to say, the Forbes family and the Thermax family, they're from a city called Pune, which is near Mumbai in India. Not sure if any of you have been. But they looked at this and they said, this can't happen again. Now, neither of these business families actually hire or have a large number of informal workers in their employ. But they said, look, something needs to be done about it. And you know what? Let's just figure this out ourselves. So what they did was, they put in some of their philanthropic capital into an organization called Dasra, one of their long-term partners. That's an excellent nonprofit organization in India. It's been working there for many, many years. And they mandated Dasra to set up some sort of an initiative which is able to increase social security for informal workers in India, right? Now, what Dasra set up was an initiative called the Social Compact. And the Social Compact basically came up with a platform and an assessment tool that helps corporates understand, are there the right measures in place to make sure that the informal workers that they're employing actually have a strong social security. Of course, it was a completely dismal state. But through the assessment, a number of corporates started to realize that when it comes to fair wages, when it comes to health and safety, when it comes to access to basic entitlements, even gender equality, these were all areas that was sorely lacking, and there was absolutely no standard in place. So through this assessment framework, corporates started to look at how they can increase that level. And of course, the Social Compact knew that just an assessment framework and working with corporates to utilize that is not going to work. So they started working closely also with worker organizations, the ones who are supplying informal workers to other big manufacturing units. They started working with local government, with civil society organizations, and they're taking a holistic approach to make sure that at any point in time, any informal worker has a contract in place, has access to the government schemes, is being trained and being upskilled, has the basic amount of safety at work in the workplace. And so over a period of time, and actually just a few short years, the Social Compact has worked with over 60 companies and has had an impact on over 300,000 workers, right? Now, when we were talking to the families about this and we said, look, you know, the fact that you took the initiative to do this, even though this doesn't really impact your business in a big way, how did you do it? Why did you do it? They told us the story of, you know, somebody needs to take action. As a family business, we have the capability to do that. We can take decisions overnight. We have, our capital is fluid in a way where, you know, we have philanthropic money available. Why not? And so their story, when they told it to us, was a focused story on philanthropy, right? They said, we did this through our foundation. It's one of the things now that we're really trying to pursue as one of our core pillars within philanthropy. So where does this 4 drivers of change framework come in, right? So we started talking to them about our 4 drivers of change within FBN. And we said, okay, were there other areas in which you've started working with the Social Compact? How about your business? Have you started using the framework? They said, yes, of course, you know, we have to put our money where our mouth is. We use the framework. We've improved our standards. And in fact, we also have been talking to our suppliers. And now, because we have such an excellent relationship with our suppliers over, you know, decades, we're able to influence them to start using these assessment frameworks also. And I said, well, that's fantastic. What about anything else? Have you been talking about the Social Compact in, you know, any forums at all? They said, oh, yeah, of course. In fact, you know what? Last year in FBN, we did a whole session on the Social Compact with all family businesses in the room. We're also trying to talk to CII, the big industry body in India, and trying to influence a larger number of companies, you know, to do that there. So I said, okay, actually then, in that case, you are using 3 drivers of change to create an impact on informal workers in India. They said, yeah. So what this helped them do is, it just helped them frame for themselves how they're actually trying to create impact here, right? It became a mindset shift of, okay, this is not just a philanthropic initiative for us. We're actually using multiple levers available to us to create a change here. It also made them question, what else can they do? Can they use investment capital here? Can that make a difference? Can they start talking to their customers more actively and asking them to use the Social Compact framework? So in a nutshell, this is what we do at FBN with business families. We talk to them about what are the big goals that they're trying to you know, create change towards, and what are all the different drivers of change available to them to create that impact, to be more intentional and to be more strategic about all the capitals that are available to them, as opposed to a more opportunistic, you know, fortuitous sort of stars aligning approach to it.
So as Jenaan said, it's really about defining the pathways, working with families, creating the connections and collaborations, because really the focus is around systemic change and what kind of impact we can create. But at the end of the day, in terms of everyone, we know that everyone in this room is not from a family business, and that, you know, maybe you don't necessarily have access to these 4 drivers of change. But we also heard from the panel today that it really all starts oftentimes with the individual, and the individual kind of understanding the role that they can play. And that's really where we started working with CSP, was also getting, you know, our members to start to understand in many ways, as Isabel even talked about, is what multi-capital is available to them. And so it's really been transformational as we've sort of started to connect the dots on these things in terms of how to start with an individual, you know, in a family, then how to actually get them to have a bigger conversation at the family business level, and then ultimately, hopefully, get them focused on a bigger picture piece. But so what we really want to do with all of you today is go back to, you know, all of your individual stories and really what resources are available to all of us, and maybe some of the things you haven't thought about in the past around what multi-capital is available to you to really start getting you on the journey to help accelerate your goals towards systems change. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Falko.
Sure, thank you, Andrew.
All right.
everybody. You've been attentively listening and sitting down all the time. So just physiologically, that's pretty difficult to keep doing for a long, long time. So despite the fact that it's a bit dense, may I invite everybody just to briefly get up, stretch your limbs, get the blood flowing a little bit. Yes, you're gonna bump into one another, but that shows our humanity. Stretch, stretch, right? Okay, nobody leave the room. Everybody sit down. Okay, so you can take a seat again. But I hope. So science will tell us that everybody is now feeling much better. And that's what we want for the next 45 minutes or so as well. So, by a show of hands, who has experienced one or maybe even multiple important turns in their lives because somebody else made an important introduction to somebody they had not had access to in their network otherwise? Whoever had to change their life because somebody introduced you to somebody that was really important? That's everybody, right? For whom of you, also by show of hands, has it been actually really helpful that if you were interested in a certain topic, issue, you could actually point to somebody else who was famous, who had a lot of gravitas, and who was actually also agitating for that topic? For example, Al Gore talking about climate change back in the days, or other famous people standing for something that you could then point to and lend their legitimacy for your cause. Anyone ever useful? Yeah, so again, everybody, right? Whoever had a turn in their life because somebody actually really helped them do something where this person was really good at and you weren't good at. Anyone ever had that experience? Okay, so that's exactly what we're going to talk about when we talk about these multi-capitals, the multi-capital framework. And that's really going back to the fact that there is not just economic capital, there is also social capital, so the access you have to certain communities, symbolic capital, what can you represent credibly, and cultural capital, what do you know and what others know. And the reason why we find this framework really, really important, especially in these audiences, and especially also often for next gens, is the following. Oftentimes, you're invited, for example, to FBN because your family has a business, there's some economic capital, but it doesn't necessarily feel really good to be reduced to a money bag, right? Or ownership of a company. You're so much more than that. You have so much more to bring to the table. And also, if we think about the gravitas, the importance of a lot of the challenges we're thinking about, climate change, etc., even if you have literally billions of liquid capital to invest, it's still nothing compared to how important the challenges are that are at hand. And a lot of the impact can really sit, in particular, in those other forms of capital, the social capital, the access you have, the gravitas you can lend. And it's really important and useful to be a bit of strategic in thinking through what type of access do you have to those different types of capitals. And that's why we're going to do a little bit of a workshop piece here today, which will help you with three things. One is to do a bit of a capitals inventory for yourself. Are there certain forms of capital that you actually haven't leveraged as much as you could? And for sure there will be. Two, also get to know one another a bit more in that regard, because you'll be discussing on your tables with your neighbors a bit. And I'm sure there will be really interesting things that you didn't even know about people that you thought you know very well in terms of what types of capitals they have. And three, well, the ambition of the next 45 minutes is only to literally change your lives. High ambition, okay? Literally change your lives. But let me tell you why. What is the one unifying skill that we all have in this room that's actually allowing us to have this conversation? The language, exactly, right? Language is a key differentiator between humans and other animals, right? We're animals just as the other animals, but we can actually talk with one another. We can convey concepts, principles, we can strategize, we can plan the future because of our language. And what we found to be super helpful is to put clear frameworks in place for something that's actually quite obvious. Like, yeah, obviously I have network, obviously I have certain skills. Yeah, we do. But you know what? We can be much more strategic about how we deploy them. And it all comes down to language. And after those 45 minutes, all of us in this room will have the same shared language thinking through these capitals. Very useful, hopefully, for the future to come. All right. So before we go into this, so I'm Falko Paetzold. I'm the founder of the Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth. We're a global organization that since about 10 years is running training programs for ultra-high net worth individuals that want to have more impact. We have about 5 programs now that are mostly run out of Stanford, MIT, now also University of Zurich. So we're very deeply rooted in science in universities, and at the same time are a global non-profit running these types of programs without any conflicts of interest. Yeah? So we never sell you products, we never do consulting. That type of work, research, training programs. There are 2 other team members of mine here as well. Creeper, Jana, you briefly want to get up so people know you? Yeah, all right. They're also going to be around for Wednesday, Thursday, be friends. Also a couple alumni or participants of the programs. Maya, you briefly want to raise your hand? Pauline. All right, so if you want to connect with them. All right, so cool. Enough of the sales, enough to plug. So we have a couple guides on the table. There's one about stories of Asian families, how they actually implement impact operationally, including Marianne and Fred Tsao, actually. How do these families really operationally implement impact? We're not going to talk more in detail today about systemic investing, but if you want to dive a bit deeper, we have an investor guide about that as well, with a bunch of case studies and so on and so forth. The key point is that systemic investing, systems thinking, and this whole multi-capital framework are incredibly interconnected. So it's a really good combination today to talk about systems on one hand, systems change, and the multi-capital piece on the other. Let me explain to you briefly why. So what systemic investing, systems thinking is, it's all about identifying trim tabs. Anyone know what a trim tab is? No. Pauline, what's a trim tab? And did you read the slide? Yes, then you know. But also, what's a trim tab? Yeah, so a trim tab is that on aeroplanes and also on boats. Obviously, aeroplanes and boats, they have a rudder, right? The rudder that determines which way the boat or the plane turns. But what I also didn't know before I got into this systemic systems thinking piece is that, did you know that every rudder has a mini rudder? That's actually called a trim tab. That's a technical term to that. And literally, the person who is accredited with being the inventor of systems thinking, on his gravestone, he wrote, "Call me trim tab." And that's because, ultimately, that's what systems thinking is all about. How can you find those actually quite little elements that dramatically determine which way the whole system turns, right? That's also called now leverage points, levers, which is a technical term, leverage points, that comes out of the whole systems thinking piece that is now a very well-known term. But that's where it all comes from. So it's really about mapping a certain system and understanding what are the little elements in that system that can really determine how the system turns. Independent of what that system is, that could be, how can I avoid food waste in the United States? And there's a family, the Fink family, who has been very strategic about mapping the food system. Who are all the actors? How are they interconnected? What's the role of regulation, philanthropy, etc.? And then being very strategic about really engaging with those levers in the system that can change the whole system. That's what systems thinking, systemic investing is all about. And there are many examples. Lucas Walton with Boulder's Vision, who've really put this into place and to entire strategic portfolios. And the key point here, and that's not the interconnection to multi-capital, is what these strategic portfolios, looking really at systems change, all have in common is that they're looking at capital in a much broader sense than what we usually do. Usually, when I say capital, what's the first thing that people think I'm talking about? Money, right? Well, no surprise, we live in capitalism. Capital is usually associated to that. But anyone read Karl Marx, Das Kapital? Read it? Yeah. What is the capital defined? Well, what does Karl Marx talk about in the book when he talks about Das Kapital?
I don't want to claim to be an expert on Marx, but the problem is not what he meant, but what people interpret today.
Okay, we can get into a very deep conversation here. Let's not go down that road. Okay, so the key point is much more, right? He talks about much more than just economic capital, and it's very important for us, like, let's take a step back and go broader than that, because what this is all about is, if you want to change a system, it's much more just about your investment capital. It's also about your philanthropy, and next step, it's a lot more about the other forms of capital. So what we've done, and there's this investor guide also available for you if you want to take a look, is we actually dug quite deeply into what is really capital, one, the whole literature behind it, the science, and we also did interviews with a lot of wealth holders who arguably have been very, very impactful of course including Andre, but also Toni Schwarz, Thorold, who's here with us right now. Also Thorold, a very important funder of this whole work. Thank you very much, Thorold, for doing that. But also, of course, you're running a whole ecosystem of activities. You're running a big conference, Catapult Future Fest, you have funds in the space, you're intervening personally. So you already are using actually all the forms of capital that you have. There just wasn't a framework yet to really talk about that. So that's what we've developed then, this whole framework about what are those different types of capitals that an individual can accumulate and deploy. So for example, natural capital, as an individual, you can't accumulate, you can't deploy. Yeah? So the difference to that is that here, this framework is all about what are the forms of capital that you as an individual can accumulate and deploy. And so that is, of course, economic capital. The important piece here is that economic capital has a particular superpower that's usually forgotten, and that is not what you can fund, but the superpower is the access that being in the position of having a business or capital, this position allows you access to certain communities, such as membership to FBN, because otherwise you can't be a member of FBN, right? Or other organizations like YPO, like The Impact, like Tonic, like any other community of wealth holders, business holders who may or may not care about impact. So the real superpower of economic capital is actually the access it creates to certain communities. Then social capital, really activating communities. And some wealth holders have been very strategic about really focusing on that. For example, Charlie and Lisa Kleisner. Anyone knows Charlie and Lisa Kleisner? Hands up. All right, so of course they're the founders of Tonic. Not only, but also together with Thorold, they founded Twist. Together we invest for systems change, a whole community of now, I think, 100 wealth holders and foundations really sharing their systemic investing strategies and so on and so forth. Then, of course, symbolic capital. Very interesting one that's often also really forgotten. So, for example, Nayana, she's an alumna of our Next Gen program as well. And Nayana's family story is one of these very typical American rags to riches stories. So Nayana's mom, literally in rags, moved from the Amazon, they were living in a village in the Amazon, to the US, created various businesses, sold those businesses, now are a family of wealth. So what do you think is a topic that Nayana can very credibly represent? And where? Out of the Amazon. Yeah? So she's in a very particular situation of being a wealth holder in the US and very credibly having the ability to stand for the interests of the people of the Amazon, because that's where she comes from, she really knows that. And so she's really using that symbolic capital to actually activate a lot of other actors around topics related to the Amazon. Or in the Next Gen program, we actually now, after 10 years of running it, for the first time ever, we have an African-American participant in the program. And going through this framework actually got this person to understand, I actually have a superpower here by being able to credibly represent the interests of African-Americans in the whole impact investing space, which others couldn't do as credibly as I can. And then, of course, the cultural capital piece. So, for example, Jess and Andrea La Mesa. Andrea La Mesa was one of the first employees of Airbnb. Now, of course, he has capital to deploy. But he actually did a big assessment of the market and didn't find it very interesting what you could do in impact currently. So they're not focusing on deploying the economic capital. He has some social capital, he has some symbolic capital, but he realized that Jess and himself, Andrea, they're very, very good entrepreneurs, and they love to work. They love to make organizations fly. And that's what they're focusing on. They are the co-CEOs of the Life You Can Save, and are very engaged also in the CSP Foundation, etc. They're like really working hard, using their abilities as an entrepreneur. And that's what they're focusing on, right? So that's the framework. I think it's very straightforward. And what I would like to do now is that you would get a few minutes to actually work through your capital inventory. And that is, of course, again, the economic capital, which is the monetary, non-monetary assets that you have. You all have this on your tables. It is a social capital. What type of communities do you have access to? Oh, and very importantly, not just what type of communities do you have access to, but how much trust do you have within these communities, right? How much weight do you have? What's the quality of the relationships you have in those communities? Cultural capital, what do you know? What can you do? And also very important here, which is usually forgotten, is what is also maybe experiences that you really have from your life, your upbringing, and also maybe from a spiritual perspective. What can you bring in there as well? And then symbolic capital. What can you really credibly stand for? The reputation you have in which circles, what themes or communities can you credibly represent? So what we're going to do now is our friendly tech team is going to play some very beautiful music for the background. And don't just like dance or fall asleep. No, we're going to work. So the idea is we have the worksheet. There are a bunch of pens on the tables. So we give you about 3 minutes yourself, 3 to 4, 5 minutes at sea. And think about, you can write in these white areas here, but not just like, what is your capital inventory? But here's the thing. What is maybe 1 or 2 areas that you have not leveraged as much as you think you could? What are maybe 1 or 2 areas in the skill inventory, the capital inventory, that you haven't leveraged as much, where you could probably do more? And after that, we'll be sharing on the tables in groups of 2s or 3s. Wouldn't do it too much. But first of all, let's take a few minutes by yourself. We play that music, have a pen ready, and work on that worksheet. Thank you. All right, so did anyone have an at all interesting conversation? So maybe we can let's vote, but via the voices. So if you had any interesting conversations on your table, so it was actually not that interesting, or it was very interesting, but it could have been more politically difficult. Yeah, you just go like, yay! It was very, very interesting. You be as loud as you could ever be. So anyone have any interesting conversations? 1, 2, 3. Yay! Okay, it wasn't very interesting. How interesting were your conversations? 1, 2, 3. Yay! All right. Look, I think most important these days in this whole impact systemic investing conversation is what are our mindsets and how well are we interconnected with one another, right? How well do we know ourselves what we can bring to the table? How strategic are we about that? And how much do we know how we can relate to others, support one another? I think that's the key piece these days, because a lot of the other pieces are there, investment opportunities, etc., can be found, but really, what can we bring to the table and how can we connect with one another to really advance that, especially in a community like FBN. So I'm really appreciative that we could do this session here and really have you guys talk with one another, explore one another a lot more. Was there anything interesting that came out of the conversation? Anything you had maybe not thought about as much yet in terms of a capital that you could leverage more? Would anyone be open to share something that came up on their table? Yo.
If I may, Falko, thank you. Oh, Mark Fox, Infinitude. Thank you very much, because it opened my eyes on two topics. One is the investment, where I have hard assets, but I don't have like natural capital asset like agriculture or forestry. And I think in the future it's really important to have this kind of assets or a house. And the second is about the network. I have a huge network, but unfortunately I'm not in harmony with my network. And to better understand, okay, what is the harmony of my network in order for me to better communicate and to see, okay, what are the synergies? So I'm always working on my own with my team, and unfortunately not sharing so much what we are doing because we are so focused on what we are doing. So, okay, how can I harmonize actually this network that are going to be doing impact investment or management of environment as I do, and how to, fit the dynamic.
Thank you so much. So you're basically looking for somebody who has a certain type of cultural capital, the knowledge to help you think through how to bring the harmony to your networks. Anyone in the room feel that resonates with your cultural capital? Like that's something you could actually help him with? Jana, why? Can you elaborate?
Sorry, that was a spontaneous thing, but I think it's just important kind of who you are, what your goals are, and then how kind of the disharmony with your network came to be, right? And how to realign that. Sorry, that's like super high level. But I actually also wanted to share something else that came as...
Just one point briefly to that, but I just wanted to showcase here, that's exactly what the framework is about, right? You realized you have a certain social capital that could be leveraged a lot more, one, and in order to access that, you are lacking a certain cultural capital, because how am I going to do that? And we are all lacking tons of cultural capital, right? Because we are only good at few pieces that one can be good at. 99.99% of the things that you could be good at, you don't, right? Because humanity is about specialization. So, and here obviously in the room there are various other people as well who would have actually that cultural capital. But only now, after spending 10 minutes on this, have you realized that piece, right? That you have a certain type of capital that could be leveraged a ton more. And for most people, most of the impact you could have actually sits a lot with your social capital, right? Especially if you're a wealth holder or a business holder. But in order to activate that, you will need something else, such as cultural capital, or in other situations, maybe somebody whose symbolic capital you could borrow, you could leverage, and so on. And as soon as you know that, you can find the solution, right? Here, Jana would have some ideas, others, and so on. So that's the language piece and how can really help you be a lot more effective. Yet another point, Jana?
Yes, thank you. So something that came up at our table was the help of high confidentiality, small circle rounds where you can, regularly go with, in this case, it was like a organization of young entrepreneurs and family business owners. And I found that very remarkable that basically, I think it was twice a year, they come together and it's super, super highly confidential. So sometimes even partners are not involved and you can ask questions in a really high circle of trust. And I think that's a really remarkable thing because I think especially in entrepreneurship, family businesses, there's some decisions that you feel a bit alone with and you don't know who to defer to get an objective answer or a recommendation. Because oftentimes the people who advise you have other kind of interests or come from an angle. So I think that was a really, really interesting point that was shared at our table. And I think that can be extremely helpful for anyone. And I learned from that I want to establish that in a bit more kind of more formal manner for me as well.
Thanks so much, Jenna. Anyone else? Anyone wants to share something that came up in their own exploration or the table conversation or so, or thinking about it now? We have a lot of smart people in the room. I'm sure you've got to. Britta, please.
Yes. So what came up here was we already know each other pretty well, and then we were thinking, well, what is a thing that you might not know yet? And then I brought up that I'm writing a book right now. And then the funny thing was that, in his first notes was actually something about book publishing. So that led to a really good conversation. Right? So it just shows your point that once you're actually bringing these points up, what is another thing you could offer? You might find somebody who then has additional knowledge or ways of helping you realize that.
All right, thank you. Was there any conversation about symbolic capital? How important it can be? Are there any, not just upsides, but also downsides to using your symbolic capital? So symbolic capital, of course, is... Ah, yeah, fantastic. Maya, please.
I was thinking about symbolic capital being next gen and how that can be both good and bad. And talking about like legacy and being anonymous versus not anonymous, and that when you're young and I actually was anonymous anyways, but and still largely am. But that there's an element of wanting to and needing to prove yourself, right? So that you aren't then just taken advantage of. But then there comes a point in your life when you we don't have time to be, in quotes, selfish and needing to prove ourselves, and we actually need to just like take advantage of what we have to get everything done that we need to get done. So there's an interesting dance there, but also like the being able to enter rooms and spaces to be a voice for next gen is also something that comes as well. So it has, interesting pros and cons.
Yeah, so that's the thing with the symbolic capital. The symbolic capital is the one where there's no going back. Right? So once you've exposed yourself as a wealth holder, one, and as a wealth holder who stands for something, two, it's out there in the media, in the internet, and so on. Now, for a lot of wealth holders, especially if you have a very important last name, that can be a really big deal. You can have incredible impact by really lending that name, the gravitas, or if you're an entrepreneur in a certain field, you're very well known for that, it can be incredibly impactful. Right? Think about Bill Gates, for example, talking about climate change topics, breakthrough energies, etc., lending his reputation to that. But what's the downside? Well, obviously, as soon as there's anything that could be brought up against you, it will be. And it will be brought against you personally and against what you're standing for. Right? So here we have the example, of course, of Andre Hoffmann. Well, as soon as there's anything problematic with Roche, surely people will, really focus on that topic and then attack Andre personally or what he's standing for on the basis of what's happening at the firm. So it's a really important decision to take and not to take. And in our programs, we are quite, spending time on like really thinking through that, because the upside is very high, but the downside is also to be, taken into account. Any perspectives on this, Risto?
Hi, everybody. I'm Risto from the Impact Office. Just quick reflection on symbolic capital. And we are here, and I recognize a lot of faces, and we all aligned, and we represent symbolic capital of impact or sustainability or purposeful or consciousness or systemic or you name it next month. But last year, I was stuck in an elevator in a Ratia house for half an hour, cheek to cheek, with 12 other people wearing puffer jackets. And things got serious very quickly. And then I realized that it's me and 12 from the management team of Bank of America. Number 2, CFO, so forth. And then security is starting going crazy. And then it's getting longer and longer, and then we start talking. And, okay, I have a captive audience. Let's talk about impact investing. And it didn't go well. We didn't agree. But what I realized is that's the audience that we need to reach. And our symbolic capital has a downside that when we do a systemic session or impact investing session, these guys don't come near to the building. So we need to sort of like bridge that gap and make it accessible and make them to come. And my version of it is that I'm not talking about impact, I'm talking about market returns, and I'm talking about market returns above. And yes, there's an impact after, but this symbolic capital is two-sided way. We have to be very careful on how we position ourselves.
All right, so first let's give Risto a hand for that situation. More so than the puffer jackets in a stuck elevator. All right. Yeah, so language, such a key point, right? So by the way, what I found very helpful is, and that's why we do quite a lot on the systemic investing element, because I present this a lot in mainstream investor conferences, systemic investing, and I don't talk about impact at all. And I often have people then come forward after and say, finally I found an angle to talk about really impact topics, climate, etc., without saying impact at all. Just talking about systemic risk, long-term risks, major trends. Because in the end, what are we talking about? We're just talking about certain themes that are shaping how our economic system will operate in 5, 10, 20 years. And there is a climate element to it, there's an energy transition, water. So the systemic element can be very helpful, especially in these mainstream audiences where impact is not the right word to use. All right, so thanks all for sharing. Now, obviously, this is just a first step in those multi-capital strategies. In the investor guide and throughout this whole research element with MIT, Jason J, etc., we developed a whole process which would be then an actual multi-capital strategy. The capital inventory is step number 1 of 5. The capital inventory is really just taking stock of what type of capitals, of course, you really do have, and then to start thinking about that strategically. Step number 2 would be to then actually, based on that, really think through which impact topics do you focus on based on your capital inventory. And what we've used quite successfully in the past was an adapted version of the Ikigai framework. So I can recommend that. It's also here in the document, other ways to do that, of course, which then really would go back to, okay, so what are the issues that really matter in the world? 1, 2, what are the topics that you personally actually feel very motivated by? Because you gotta still get out of bed every day to work on that. And importantly, based on your multi-capital inventory, which issues would make sense for you to work on? So, for example, at FBN Next Gen in Istanbul, I ran this Ikigai piece, and there was one guy in the room who was very passionate about animal rights, 1, and poverty, 2, and he wasn't sure what to focus on. First thing I asked him, what's your family business? Well, guess what? It's a bank in an emerging market. Well, if you would have told me that you have a pig farm in the emerging markets and are like one of the biggest animal, cattle, whatever, producers, well, then focus maybe more on the animal rights piece, because you can actually do something about that based on your economic capital. But now if you have a bank, you care about poverty, well, very straight line here to think more about how can you leverage the bank, right? Microfinance solutions, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where this impact-focused identification piece comes in. Then system awareness, step 3. So within that issue, starting to think about how does the system actually look like in that issue? What are the leverage points? Then the deployment strategy, so actually really go out, deploy. And step 5, then assessing, well, how is that all going? And then, of course, reinventing how you're actually going about the topics that you focus on, the deployment strategy, and so on. And we found that a lot of wealth holders go through various cycles. So, for example, Sam Bonze, that maybe some of you may know, who just stepped down as the CEO of The Impact. He's in his 30s now. He's just going through his 3rd iteration cycle of that, right? Reviewing which focus areas to have, his capital inventory, and then changing his deployment strategy. So this tool is step 1 of 5, but please feel free to have the worksheet. We're very happy to send it to you, use the guides. Everything is available for free, of course, on the website, cspglobal.org, or the frameworks we're happy to share. This is a very nice way to get groups to know one another. So I can just recommend you guys to maybe, use that whenever you run such sessions. Can be really, really nice, really fruitful conversations, and people get to know one another better. Okay, so thanks for running the workshop so patiently with me. I'll hand back to Andrew and Jenaan, and thank you very much for engaging so much. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Falko. So at this point, we wanted to just wrap up with a couple of things. First of all, as Falko said, we'll keep this up here for a little while. If you're interested in getting in touch with Jenaan and I about FBN, or even interested in becoming a member, if you're not one, feel free to use the QR code. We have Falko and Jana's email address is up here, so we're happy to connect and communicate. We also, you may have noticed or not, Ole's been sitting here on the side and actually putting together a map of the conversations that we've been having here. So we wanted to share that actually also quickly with you all. So you could start to see like how this conversation's come together and the work that he's done on it as well.
Yeah, so I'm, like disclaimer, I'm not an illustrator, but I like to map systems. And when the topic is about system mapping, then it's really thing. And I need to get it out of presentation mode, and everybody can get this afterwards, I think. Yeah. Oh, there we go, I think. Sorry. So the landscape here is are we zoomed in? Sorry about that. It's still in presentation mode. You've zoomed though. I have zoomed, then we're good. Okay, anyway, sorry. So the sketch here that you're seeing is really from the left. We're looking at, there we go. think so. Well, sorry, there's still an issue. Anyway, you'll see it here. The idea is that you guys are sitting down in the left. It's a house. That's your estates. Then you're meeting up at the center stage. There's a family tree. All of the conversations we had in the beginning from the panel, they're just scattered around. But the main thing here is that you see the cloud in the middle, and that's really like having a systems change with the four drivers, and then also with the multi-capital framework. And basically, you're on 4 different paths down here, from isolated innovation into some kind of effort where you bring together your resources and go towards a coordinated system change. So really, down to the out there in the horizon is the legacy. And the idea here is, as a summary of this session, but the whole point with the visual is also really giving a visual framework for a larger conversation and grasp the complexity of what this session was about. And we'll follow up with updates so it's reflected and maybe a little bit more color-coded. And I hope everybody got a little bit visual of that. Anyway.
Great, thank you, Ole. Perfect. So yeah, we just wanted to share this because, obviously we've been covering a lot of different complex concepts here, and often seeing them visually, brings them home in a whole different way. So if we could just go back to the presentation. So once again, feel free to reach out to any of us. We'd love to further the conversations. But also, most importantly, we also want you all to just take a quick minute to give feedback on the session. So if you could click on the QR codes. For us at FBN, also at Intent, it's just super, super important that we get feedback on what you thought of the session, how we can improve, all those sort of things. So if you could just take a couple of minutes before you leave to give feedback, it would be greatly appreciated. But thank you all for being here. It's been great to spend these past couple of hours with you, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you all going forward. Thank you very much.